For those who don't know me, I am Razia Iqbal. I work for BBC News. It's great to still be here, and thank you very much for still staying for the final session. We're on the home straight. This one is entitled Populism and the New World Disorder. I'd like to thank Mark for handing me the easy subjects during this weekend. And we have on the panel to discuss these weighty issues. To my left is Valerie Plame, ex-CIA operative, who we heard being incredibly engaging and interesting yesterday. To her left is Unni Karunakara, who is actually, you're all former something. I've just realized. Yeah. Valerie is former CIA operative. You are the former president of Médecins Sans Frontières, yes. Now an academic at Yale of public health. And Jeffrey Feltman is former Under Secretary of Political Affairs, Under Secretary General of the UN of Political Affairs. Welcome to you all. So I suppose we ought to just start by, I think, talking about, let's talk about the New World Disorder first, because the populism feeds into it, rather than dealing with populism first, I think. If we think about the New World Order as it was post-1945, underpinned almost entirely by the strength and power of the United States in terms of having set up institutions, not least the United Nations, all those Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and so on, underlining the need for international cooperation between countries. That all seems to be not just slightly, but seriously being challenged. Jeffrey, let's start with you to get some sense of a reflection on how quickly that appears to have happened, with the Trump administration deciding to pull out of the TTPP, the Paris Accord, and the Iran nuclear deal.
Well, thanks, Razia, for the question. And again, thanks to Mark and Beyond Borders for having us here today. I think it happened fairly quickly. The roots of the problems we're facing were probably there, but they've been unleashed quite quickly. In the last 30 years, the U.S. administration that was most supportive of multilateral approaches was the Obama administration. The administration that was most supportive of the United Nations was the Obama administration. And we went from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. And the Trump administration almost immediately started pulling out of these things. But what concerns me is that the populism and that the skepticism is not confined to any one type of country. It's not just that the rich countries are starting to question these orders. You look at the Philippines. You look at Turkey. You look at the populism in India. You look at the Brexit movement here, or Hungary, Poland. You can name it. What really concerns me is that the Trump administration may be the most visible manifestation of a phenomenon that concerns me, but it's not just the Trump administration. It's not just the United States. It's all over. And we have to find a way to restore some confidence in international cooperation. Now, part of it's the UN's fault. The UN hasn't. We can all see the failures of the UN. Part of it is the UN. If you get with a bunch of UN officials, we're all going to start talking, and it'll be in English, but you won't understand us because we'll be talking in a language that doesn't relate to what average people say. But I am convinced that the problems that we all face today require more than one country's leadership, requires cooperation, and we have to find a way to reverse the erosion that I think has happened quite quickly.
Unni, let's talk about your experience at the coalface as the former president of MSF. The manifestation of the lack of cooperation must be pretty real and tangible on the ground.
Yes. World War II and up to the fall of the Soviet Union, the focus was on decolonization. Sovereignty was a big thing. Development was a big project undertaken by the United Nations. Then, of course, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we entered the era of liberal peace, where we were talking about responsibility to protect. I think these were as you said yesterday, a principle-based a time where UN and principles mattered. I think something changed in 2001. We are now in the era of security. And when countries invoke security, then human rights they're of secondary importance. And let's not forget that UN is only as good as its members. And if members are undermining the very principles that they signed on to, even a country like Denmark 2 years ago was talking about getting out of the Geneva Convention.
Seizing assets.
Yeah, seizing assets, etc. And these are Scandinavian countries for very long occupied the moral high ground when it came to human rights. And even they have been in the previous years, subject to populist sort of anti-immigration sort of sentiments in the country.
Valerie, does that resonate with you when Unni talks about the watershed moment being 9/11? We know it was for many, many different reasons, and the fallout and the ramifications we are continuing to live with today. But that primacy of security above everything else seems to be quite a red line. Mm-hmm. How do you reflect on that?
Precisely. Looking back, you spoke all the institutions, the international institutions that were set up in the wake of World War II. I think it's fair to say unleashed an era of prosperity across globally that we have never seen the likes of. So, with the advent of 2001. Things have changed, and I think we would all be well advised to ask, what is it that these institutions are not delivering? Why is there such an erosion of trust? How is it that we find ourselves where we are today? 2001, I was, when 9/11 happened, I was in CIA headquarters, and I knew immediately we were at war, and the following months around the world, you could see the fear where all of us, when we finally, at least in the United States, were allowed back on airlines, immediately the jacked up security systems that were in place. Fear is a hugely motivating factor, and it also cows millions of people. And that's where we find ourselves. And I remember maybe a year or two after 9/11, I checked into some hotel room in the United States, and I turned on the TV to unpack. And the message came on, rather than, hello, welcome to Hotel, Naughty Bob. It said, if you see something, say something. And it was so chilling. And that was just emblematic of what we have seen over and over and over again, until all of us, of course, if you flew here, we all got in line and took our shoes off and took our belt off, and everything that is just an encapsulation of the fear that we have all been placed under.
Well, let's talk about the way in which leaders in specific countries around the world have used that fear, because that, in a way, does feed into the notion of the emergence of populist leadership. And I suppose it would be valuable, or perhaps I don't know what you think, that to just talk a little bit about what populism is, because it has been used pejoratively. It clearly relates to both right and left on the political spectrum. You mentioned some of the countries, Jeffrey, where populist leaders have emerged. Essentially, it means, it's been around for a very long time, populism as a political idea, as far back as the French Revolution. This idea of being concerned with ordinary people is a very potent one, because if you argue that you are against populism, what is it that you're against? You're against looking after the majority of people in a society. And that's what's interesting about the way in which leaders have used them speaking directly for the people. So to what extent do you think populism has become a threat to democracy? When you talk about, you know, because it's used as a tool, right? I mean, President Trump speaks directly to the people.
No, he just tweets directly.
Yes,
to
but that's a direct communication, right? And he communicates as much with those who agree with him as he does with those who don't agree with him. And it's a very powerful tool. And I wonder whether you see it, Jeffrey, as a potential erosion of democracy.
I certainly see it as a speaking now as a former UN official, but as a current U.S. citizen. I see it as a threat to our interests as Americans. Politicians are going to try to find messages to appeal to voters. That's normal. Politicians are going to try to find something that resonates with the average person to try to build and expand the base. To the extent that they're using populist messages, I think that's probably just what politicians would do. But when the message starts being, what I would argue, at serious odds with the interests of the country, with the Constitution, with the ideals of a country, that's when it becomes a problem. And that's where I see an issue now with the United States, because there's an inherent racism to some of the messages that are being projected now by the president, and that's dangerous. That's unleashing a type of hatred and polarization inside our country that's going to be very hard to tap down later. And on security, take security. Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said about 2001 being a watershed in terms of having security be primus inter pares among a lot of other goals. But that would argue that you do things like you preserve cooperation, you preserve and nurture non-coercive voluntary alliances like NATO. That's not what's happening now. You see attacks by the President of the United States against institutions like NATO that are related to security. There's a zero-sum mentality to this form of populism that is antithetical to the idea that we should be cooperating to address common challenges.
So when we look at security in a very broad way, and you look at the two things that President Trump has focused on most recently, so pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal and his engagement with North Korea. So the potential for a nuclear catastrophe and a war and conflict on the Korean Peninsula is possibly the greatest security threat that faces the world, which is why it's important to find a way of resolving it. But I wonder, Valerie, I mean, you talked yesterday about being a supporter of the Iran nuclear deal and thinking that it was important. It is arguable, isn't it, that in terms of the international geopolitical landscape, if the Americans can't be trusted to keep to the deal that is a multilateral deal negotiated over 15 years, if they can't be trusted to keep to that deal, it doesn't bode well for the North Koreans looking on, however much it's fantastic to have a photo opportunity with President Trump, to say, well, actually, to what extent can we trust this country?
Well, you would be correct. Yes, no one has accused the Trump administration of coherence, particularly in their policies today. So because I've been traveling here, I missed a little bit of the news, but apparently the summit that Trump and Kim Jong-un had in Singapore, which resolved everything happily overnight, has now fallen apart. And apparently the problem still exists of North Korea and nuclear weapons. Yes, to me, that is one of the most potential flashpoints of nuclear accidental accident than we have anywhere else in the world. Because you have two very impulsive leaders. Each are vying with, they have political and of course international pressures on it. I'm deeply concerned about that. And then related to the Iran nuclear deal, it remains to be seen how exactly this is going to work. In terms, yes, we withdrew unilaterally from a multilateral deal, and now you've had Trump saying, although consistency not a strong suit, but he did say, okay, we're not going to deal with anyone who has business in Iran. Well, that's going to be a problem. It just makes no sense, and it's hard. I find myself in the position of just arguing against what they are doing, but it's incoherent. It's constantly shifting. There is no through line. There is no ultimate objective. As you were saying, Jeffrey, you would think these institutions that undergird better security would be nurtured. That's not anything the Trump administration does well, but it's head scratching.
Go ahead.
I live in South Korea, so I wanted to be.
I was just going to ask you about that.
So I want to be slightly optimistic. I think you're right. South Korea considers the United States an unreliable partner now, especially of all the things that you said. But at the same time, North Korea is realizing that they cannot rely on China anymore. So China is not a reliable partner for North Korea either. So that has led to a completely a different dynamic, pushing South Koreans to speak to North Koreans together. And as we sit here now, South Korean families are in North Korea on a reunification visit. So I think there are shifts occurring in the region. We have no idea where the chips are going to fall, right? And I think that's important to note. And Middle East, the fallout of Iran, collapse of that deal. India, where I come from, they get all of their oil from Iran, right? So if Trump insists,
So does that mean we don't do any?
Yeah, and it can lead to
nonsensical.
economies crashing and all sorts of fallout effects with what's happening, like in Turkey at the moment.
Jeffrey, did you want to say something?
I'd like to add something on North Korea if I could. I was in North Korea at the beginning of December 2017. The Secretary General sent me out for 5 days to have talks to try to lower tensions. You remember September 6th last year was the 6th nuclear test. North Korea defies the international community yet again. The end of September was the General Assembly when Trump talked about the total destruction of North Korea, and Kim Jong-un responded in kind. November 29th was that long-range missile that showed how much North Korea's missile technology had advanced. The rhetoric was increasing, tensions were high. I arrived at the beginning of December for 5 days to try to see if there was a way to lower tensions. I went to North Korea quite concerned. I left North Korea absolutely terrified.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Yeah. The logic.
Sorry, Unni. It's not good.
No, but I'll get to the optimism.
I'll keep going.
Because the logic of the North Korean argument, I won't go summarize the 5 days of talks we had, but they were intense, very intense talks, arguments, shouting, from early in the morning through midnight. But the logic of the North Korean argument was as follows: we know the United States wants to destroy us. Trump says so. We know that we haven't invested sufficiently in air defenses. That our weakness is our air defense, lack of air defense. We know the U.S. has overwhelming military power. So therefore, when we know that Trump is about to attack us, we will go first, because that's our chance. It's like, well, what if you're wrong? What if you're misreading the signs? What if there's some sort of accident along the DMZ or in the northern limit line of the West Sea that you've misinterpreted the U.S. intentions? You think your country will be destroyed? No, we'll know when he's about to attack us, and we will go first, because that's our only chance of inflicting pain before we're hit. So I left terrified, thinking, there's going to be one side or the other is going to misread the intentions of the other, and there's going to be an accidental war. The sleepwalking into war that the British historian Christopher, I forget his last name, wrote about World War I. I saw that unfolding in our future. So I am encouraged that at least there are now channels of communication that are open, because now there's a way to convey intentions or check intentions. There's a way to reduce the threat of accidental war. The threat of war is still there, but the accidental war that I was convinced we could witness when I was there in December, I think has receded because of the communications. I think that what Trump did in Singapore was superficial. It was a message about Trump's narcissism more than anything else. But it did open the communications links, and I give all sorts of credit to South Korean President Moon Jae-in for opening the communication channels, for making sure that they could open the communication channels between North and South Korea, because I think it was important to reduce that risk of an accidental war.
I want to move on to, you mentioned China, Unni. I want to talk a little bit about China, because in these reflections on the rise of populism, whether it's in countries such as, Viktor Orban's Hungary, or in Poland, or however unsuccessful Marine Le Pen was in France, there was the rise of the strength of the far right there. And there are others, and on the left, of course, the results, the continuing legacy of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and so on. So all of these populist movements are there, but you could argue that a really significant thing that has disrupted the new world order that we've lived with since the Second World War is the rise of China. And the rise of China, not just in terms of it being an economic powerhouse, but in 2017, the way in which Xi Jinping has successfully cemented his place and the primacy of the Communist Party and his place in it. And I wonder, Unni, what you make of that in your perspective from just living in the Far East. What do you think of that, and what kind of impact? Because it is a different perspective. We obsess in this country about the terrible ramifications that might emerge after Brexit, and what might happen, let alone what the ramifications are. We don't even know what's going to happen. And continuously, daily, looking at what Trump says on Twitter. But the rise of China, I think, is so significant, and it's almost as though we're not looking at that as part of what is disrupting the New World Order.
Well, if you allow the middle class to grow and consume, you can stay in power. Right? I think China has done that very well. But you see that in India as well. What Narendra Modi, who's been accused of horrific crimes when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, is now Prime Minister because he was seen to be an able administrator and could deliver the same growth rate as the previous governments did. So it does not matter any longer, at least in my sort of calculation, whether you're a democracy or a state like China or even a state like Russia. If you allow the middle class, create the economic conditions for the middle class to grow and consume and go for their 2 international holidays a year, then they're much more likely to have a party like the Communist Party in China in power. Now, Xi Jinping's lifelong appointment is predicated on delivering that growth rate. Right? They have to grow the economy at a steady clip, and the moment that slows, that'll be the end of him as well.
And I wonder, Valerie, what you make then of about China emerging as the new enemy when we look at the trade war between the US and China emerging in the way that it is.
I am no China expert, that's for sure. It seems, I will speak from the perspective of being a U.S. citizen and watching this administration. Trump is seizing on various things, and it changes from day to day to continue to excite his base. Of course, he did campaign on promises of, sort of a better deal, a fair deal, although I think that was a Democratic slogan. But I can actually understand how an American voter saw in the campaign of 2016 the only person in Trump saying, I actually care about you and your job going to Mexico, or the unfair deals with China and so forth. I can understand, okay, I got nothing else to lose. Democrats aren't paying any attention to me and voting for Trump. Well, now we know exactly what we have. But in regard to the China deal, I think it remains to be seen. Not much pain has yet been felt by either side. It's a very dangerous game of chicken, I think.
Let's talk a little bit then about the manifestation of populism in terms of leadership, because there clearly are strong men at the heart of populist movements, whether it's Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey or President Duterte in the Philippines or President Trump. To what extent do you think, Jeffrey, that this is a real threat to democracy? Because the direct access to the people that a strong man has, whether it's Duterte saying the most absurd things at a press conference or President Trump similarly tweeting whatever he wants. I mean, there is a tendency of populist leaders to completely disregard institutions. And I wonder what you think that the impact of that is on the things that we take for granted in terms of what underpins democracy.
I think that we should be concerned when there's disdain for the rule of law, when there's disdain for the regular constitutional practices and norms that a country has. I think that there is a real risk. The way our system is supposed to work. I'm not an expert on Philippine government. I suspect that there's some similarities given the colonial past, but we're supposed to have checks and balances. Right now, we don't really have much of the check and balance through the Congress because of the congressional Republicans have decided not to take on Trump and some of the erosion that he's promoting in terms of the rule of law. They're doing it for political reasons, for primary reasons. I think we really do have to be concerned at this erosion, and I think that it's the same phenomenon that's happening inside these countries is what's happening internationally. That the erosion of support, the preference for populist rhetoric for that is more important than the rule of law to some of these leaders is also what's explaining why some of these same leaders are then disdainful and get people behind skepticism over the international rules of order.
Unni.
So populism is democracy, but it's an extreme form of democracy. So we are used to, in almost all of our country, representative democracy. We elect people to represent us in Parliament or in the Congress or in the Senate. Well, in populist sort of version of democracy, it's the institutions, the other institutions like the courts and the military, they're all seen to be occupied by elites. So you shortcut the institutions and you have a direct line between the people and their leader. And so one could argue that also gives rise to authoritarian tendencies. And you see that in India, even though it's a parliamentary democracy, the prime minister functions like a president. So the prime minister's office is in many ways more powerful than the ministers. So those are features, I would argue, of a populist government, but they get elected by democratic means. And they need they need elections to justify their presence or their positions as well.
Valerie, you said a little yesterday in your interview with Alan on your reflections of what the Trump administration, or President Trump particularly, has said about the intelligence services. I mean, in order for a democracy to function effectively, we need facts. And one of the things that intelligence services provide administrations, governments, is good intelligence. And if the institution is being undermined, I wonder how you think the CIA, the FBI, the State Department, how they are coping with the undermining of the institutions.
Yeah. I think, I have a acknowledged bias. I think a strong intelligence service can be useful, but there's always a threat that it will be politicized. This isn't anything new. Presidents get into power and all of a sudden they go, oh, I've got the CIA here. What do you know? And you constantly have to be on guard about that. And in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, hundreds of years of operational experience walked out the door at the CIA because my former colleagues said, we don't like how this is unfolded. And so here we are now where the CIA, the FBI is under pretty much continual attack. if you are not careful, you allow your policy to be politicized, then you become nothing more than a banana republic in no time.
Jeffrey, something similar happened at the State Department, and it's been a while since you were there, but there are still posts that have not been filled at the State Department. There is expertise that was there for decades and decades and decades, not least in terms of North Korea and many other parts of the world. And State Department officials have either been let go under Rex Tillerson and his attempt to make the State Department more efficient, and continue under Mike Pompeo. I mean, I wonder what you make about the impact of that.
Well, I think that the State Department went through over the past year what Valerie described that the CIA went through several years ago, that sort of exodus of talent, exodus of experience happened in the State Department during the first year of the Trump administration. I think that one thing that Pompeo, whatever you think of his political views, is doing is he's trying to reassure the institution, the people of the institution, that he knows that there's good diplomatic talent. From what I understand from colleagues who are still there, mostly people who worked for me who are still there, my peers are pretty much all gone. Is that the morale is higher now under Pompeo. Of course, it's hard to imagine it could be any lower than it was under Tillerson. But because I don't think what Tillerson or even the White House understood is how needy the Foreign Service culture is. That basically you can get the Foreign Service on your side if you simply listen to them and at least pretend to acknowledge that they have expertise and experience. Maybe in the end, the politicians will say, well, phooey, we don't like what they said, we don't agree with what they said. But if they play the game, the State Department Foreign Service officers will be eating out of the politicians' hands. All they want is attention and acknowledgement that they have a trade craft.
But of
it's
course
very easy. In other words, it's very easy to manipulate those of us that were part of the State Department by attention.
But you were just seen as an elite that were
So-
easy to dismiss. Let's open questions up to the floor. Lady's hand that's just gone up in the yellow jacket.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about political leaders and populism and intelligence services and populism. What hasn't been mentioned and what really concerns me is the shadowy figures who are seeking to manipulate populism. I mean, for example, nobody said anything about Steve Bannon and the meetings that he's been having across Europe with all the leaders who are likely to destabilise Europe. And I think I'd like to know what you think about that, because I'm really concerned about the hidden things. You also mentioned Mossad yesterday. I'd like to know what you think about that.
Mention, what was the last?
Mossad.
Ah. Oh,
So anyone
okay.
want to tackle the influence of
Go on,
Breitbart and Steve Bannon?
Go with
and
Steve
No,
Bannon.
I think that you're right to be concerned. I think that Steve Bannon, I mean, he's vocal about it. He's transparent. He does want to see the destruction of the European Union. And of course, there's some sympathy in this country for that view. There's sympathy in the countries he's visiting for that view. As an American, I think it's in our interest that there be a strong EU. It's a way to manage relationships rather than have bilateral relationships between the United States and every one of 28 or 27 countries. I think it's good to have this organizing principle for the EU. But I'm speaking as a European, as an American citizen. Europeans have to make up their own minds about what they think of the EU. But Bannon is definitely on a campaign to reduce support with the aim of destroying the EU. And I think that I can see how it can happen. You make a deal with Poland, thinking about playing on Polish concerns about Russia. You start splitting the Central Europeans away from the core. It's easy to envision how this could work.
May I just add something? So, good question. But your question demonstrates, again, that concern I think that we all have in this room of there's stuff going on that we don't really know about. And I would venture that part of that is true. There are things behind the scenes that are happening. There are tectonic shifts that we are not quite understanding. And then that's off-played against the crazy QAnon conspiracy stuff that's out there. And at least in the United States, we have a president right now who, despite his many shortcomings, is really, really good at pulling threads of that out. And back to my first point about fear. And that's where we are.
Hand in the middle, just there.
Thank you. Thinking of populism as a maladaptive political response, I'd be really interested in your reflections on climate change and also climate change denial and alliances with fossil fuel extraction.
Go on.
I think you're the man for this one, Unni.
Well, I mean, I think the science is undeniable. Right? I think we do the scientists a disservice by sort of repeatedly sort of questioning the science again and again. Right? But there is this larger thing about what do facts mean anymore. So even when there's overwhelming scientific evidence, I teach at Yale University. Students have difficulty nowadays distinguishing fact from opinion. Right? I had this discussion with students 1 week after the elections, and that very same week, the Senate Science Committee of the United States sent out a tweet. They tweeted a Breitbart article debunking climate science. Right? So when the leaders are doing that and they don't respect facts, how can you expect the younger generation and students, even at leading universities, to sort of take facts seriously?
Or to discern the difference.
Discern the difference. And this is a big problem, I think, going forward, because today, internet flattens everything. Mm-hmm. You do a Google search, it could pick up something from Lancet, and it could pick up an opinion from Breitbart, but it all seems the same. You weight it the same, because it's something you pick from internet. So, in a way, it was interesting hearing William speak earlier. A lot of the points I wanted to make about, the corporations and their rapacious tendencies is something that happened 2 years ago. But in between, we had a period where nation states, for some reason, they were able to control economy, information, politics at the national level. And we are now getting out of that period again, where information is no longer controlled by states, Google, Facebook, etc. Economy is no longer controlled by states.
Borders are permeable.
Borders are permeable, right? Today, again, citizenship is deeply unequal. If you're born in Finland or if you're born in the UK, it's like inherited property, as Rana Dasgupta would say, that immediately gives you a leg up compared to someone who's born in DR Congo, right? So deep inequalities, not just within nations, but globally, and it'll take a lot of effort to kind of shift that and address that in any coherent sort of way.
There's a real manifestation of the world being upside down when the President of the United States is a protectionist president and Xi Jinping goes to Davos and speaks about globalization and the importance of...
There's never been a real free trade, even the US had deeply protectionist tendencies when it comes to their agriculture sector. At the heart of a free market economy are patents, which are, again, you keep your monopoly for 20 years or 30 years, and you make profit off it, right? So free trade was never really that free, and we need to accept that.
Okay. Lady in the middle.
Thank you. We all really know that this shifting of tectonic plates is going on. But the question for me is, how can we combat matters like the infiltration of fake news, the infiltration of ideas that is undermining our balanced outlooks, that is bringing about or attempting to bring about the destruction of the European Union? I mean, we've heard today and over the weekend from excellent journalists. You know, we've had Joni from the New York Times and Alan Little. And journalists are doing, a number of journalists are doing an excellent job, but not everybody reads those newspapers, those BBC reports, and your own work, Razia. How do we begin to combat this stream, this hidden stream that is beginning to destroy our own balance? I mean, Valerie, you've been a spy. You must know about infiltration and the hidden places and how we might somehow be able to begin to combat this better than we currently are.
Very briefly, I would just say I get asked that question a lot when I speak to university students. And the best thing I can say at this point, I say take in as information from different sources, particularly international, because in America, you know, we're so short-sighted in that regard. And when you start seeing issues from an international perspective, or, you know, how the Turkish newspapers, how do they read what's going on in Washington? Or it's very helpful. And you have to, of course, align that with your own compass and your own critical thinking abilities, which, of course, are in very short supply. I'm sure you have better ideas.
I mean, you talked about triangulation of news sources.
Yeah.
But one practical, perhaps positive example is during the last Kenyan election, there was a group of students who used technology basically to detect rumors and right away counter them. So that was a very successful example.
How? Like, how did they,
They-
online? Was it online?
Online.
Yeah, yeah.
So they would be
Like Snoops?
monitoring,
Snoops
and they
Kenya?
would pick up I don't know exactly, no, but they would pick up these rumors and respond right away. You have to kill it before it goes viral. That's a technical solution to, but I don't know. The larger question remains. It's not just the people who put out fake news. We have low attention spans. We don't read beyond headlines, right? So the problem is much bigger than just them. It's also us and how we process news and how much attention. No one reads the long reads in Guardian and New Yorker magazine.
It's not true.
Right? Yeah, but yeah.
I do.
Yeah. No, I do as well, but
We've got a hand that's gone up right at the back. Oh, it's Alan.
Thanks, Razia. I'm a bit disturbed about the comment that was made by somebody about populism being an extreme form of democracy, because it seems to me that we need a working definition of what populism is. And one key element of populism is that it is a way of delegitimizing legitimate dissent, legitimate opposition.
True.
A populist leader is somebody who says, I won the referendum, or I won the election, therefore I am the embodiment of the will of the people. And if you're against me, you're against the will of the people. You are placing yourself outside the people, therefore you are the enemy of the people. And that is the beginning of the end of democracy, because it's the beginning of the end of an idea that's key to the successful sustainability of democracy, which is pluralism, the idea that there's more than one legitimate way of seeing the world. There's more than one legitimate way of interpreting events. And I think we should be very, very clear about what populism is. It is not simply, Francis Fukuyama wrote after the election of Donald Trump, that populism is simply what elites call elections that go against what they want. That is fantastically complacent and dangerous. And I wonder whether we can even agree what populism is.
so I made that comment.
You
Sorry.
did.
Yeah, you jump in.
So the three core elements of any populist sort of enterprise. You have the people, and the people are considered pure, and you can decide, or in the US, who are the people? It's the white male in this administration, or with Trump, it's just the white male. So you select who the people are, and then the corrupt elite, how the economic elite, the media elite, the all of the elites, and then the general will. So they use the language of democracy to legitimize whatever they do, and they are. When they ignore the courts or when they ignore institutions, they are basically, as you said, they are expressing the general will of the people. Now, yes, we are all in a liberal democratic sort of, if we all subscribe to that, we want pluralism. But, even if Rousseau talks about, self-determination, republic, utopia, and this is one expression of it. But of course, we've gone beyond that, and we have democracy that we all subscribe to. But it is not undemocratic. They use the democratic language to give themselves the legitimacy to do what they do.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
what I
more
meant.
than that. I mean, Hugo Chavez said, "I'm not an individual, I am the people."
Yeah.
And that gives him the legitimacy that he required.
I thought Alan's comment was very well put, and I have a question, which is, of those elements of populism that we're talking about, is racism always a piece of it? Is it always there? Or are we just...
No, it
Not
doesn't have to
necessarily.
be.
But it's the other.
Yeah.
the
It
other.
goes back to what Alan said. It's delegitimizing or talking about the other. So it might not be racism. It might be the elite.
Yeah.
But there's
The other.
there's an other that you have to fight against.
You have to blame someone.
Okay.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there is one. Okay, the hand just gone up there. You've put your hand back down again. It's tentative.
What I've been thinking about quite a lot this weekend, and I wonder if you agree, is that in all of this talk about populism and what makes people tick, there seems to be a huge appetite just for hateful speech. I mean, divorced from what the speech is being hateful about. Where I live in Italy, we have a particularly strange phenomenon where we have two parties that hate each other who are in a coalition, and the more dominant one of these used to be called the Northern League, because they were all about saying that people in the South are horrible parasites, that they're lazy, and that we need to get out of Italy. And then they reinvented themselves as a party that hates Europe instead. So now the Northern League has done really well in the South, and Sicilians who are horrible bloodsuckers voted for them in a huge majority. And today we've had our delightful Minister of the Interior, who is the head of this party, has refused to allow one of these immigrant ships to let people off. They're in a port in Italy, and he is now being investigated for sequestration and reckless endangerment because it's illegal to have all these people in a ship which is 100 meters long. And he's quoting Mussolini and saying, just come and get me, I'm fine. And you could perfectly well in Italy have measured discourse about how immigration is a huge problem, that the EU is not being very fair in the application of its measures, and that Italy really is on the front line. But that's not what he's trying to do. He's just trying to sell hate. And you see the same thing with Trump. You see the same thing with the way Fox News, when you turn it on, it's not what they're saying, it's the sound of their voices. You certainly hear it here with the way people are talking about Brexit. And to go back to what Valerie said, I think also about why nobody is bothered about why Trump is so totally incoherent. It's just they want to hear that message of poking at people and hating people and disliking people, really in a way which is much more dissociated from the subject of the hatred than I've ever seen before. Does that make sense to you? Do you think that's the way the world is going? Or am I kind of just having an idea that I'm
The
going to
world
get
doesn't
over?
make sense to me at all. But it goes back to the other, right? We've been that way tribally. When we first came out of the cave and you see someone who doesn't look like you or not part of your tribe, and that's where we are, I think, today. Except writ large, we have 7 billion people now.
Populism is not an ideology in itself, I think. It's very opportunistic. It's not an ideology like liberalism or socialism or fascism. So it latches on. So you know, on the left sometimes and on the right sometimes, right? So it picks on. So agrarian populism or socioeconomic populism in Latin America. And now, of course, in Europe, we have a very nativism, nationalism and populism coming together. And the other is very clear. These are the people coming on boats, and they're going to upset our way of life. And they are, of course, to link all of the discussions we had earlier about dehumanization, all of that is going on. They're characterized as swarms, they're insects, they're roaches to be crushed. So all of that is going on at the moment. So I happen to think that it is a symptom of the larger economic sort of, we are again, after the days of the East India Company, we're looking at a neoliberal rampant phase where money is flowing out. You can take capital out of a country, but labor is not allowed to follow, right? They have to stay where they live and work, but the capital is taken out. So all of this leads to young people no longer seeing an economic future with themselves. And what is happening in the Middle East is one expression of people sort of blowing things up literally. And here in the US, you vote for Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. These are all different expressions of the fear that people face for the future. I see that in my work in all of the countries where I work. People have, I mean, we can put all of the money providing humanitarian assistance, but if we keep taking capital out of those countries, whether it's Congo, the amount of money that flows out of Congo is not funny. So if you keep, just like the British East India Company did in India, that's happening now. And it's not just Europe and America, it's China as well, taking large sums of capital out. So if we don't address the deeper political, and that's the job for someone like you, to
Former.
Oh boy,
Former.
that would have been his job last year.
Former.
he's retired now.
Yeah, exactly.
And sadly, we have to too. We could,
Yeah,
of course, with this subject, carry on and on and on. But I'm going to have to draw it to a close. My thanks to Jeffrey Feltman, Unni Karunakara, and Valerie Plame. Thank you very much. And just before I head off to London, I'd like to thank Mark and everyone on Beyond Borders. And I think he's going to come back onto the stage and say something, or Catherine is too. Thank you very much. Thank you.